Want to welcome to the program Assistant Professor of History at University of Chicago, author of The Next Shift, The Fall of Industry and the Rise of Healthcare in Rust Belt America. Gabriel Winnett, welcome to the program. I'm here with Emma Vigland.
Hi, nice to be here. Thanks for having me on.
So this is your book is in some part ethnography and in some part sort of a story of systems and really the rise and fall of two different types of economies and their relationship with each other. It really is fascinating. Let's just start with this, and then we'll circle back around. Give us a sense of the healthcare economy in this country. We got $400 billion set aside in the infrastructure bill, ostensibly to deal with this sector of the economy. There's more to come, but give us a sense of just how big this is, because one of the things that your book reveals is also how little we seem to be aware of it.
Yeah, so healthcare has kind of eaten the economy over the last generation or two. And, you know, there are some ways that you and I might come across this in our daily lives and the costs we pay for care, right, how they've gone up or something. But I think you really see something amazing if you look at it in terms of employment. Healthcare is the biggest sector of employment in America. Now, 14% of all jobs in this country are in the category called healthcare and social assistance. And in particular, in big northern and Midwestern, formerly industrial cities, that number gets significantly higher. So my book is about Pittsburgh, where that number is like 18, 19%, almost 1 in 5 jobs. In the Bronx, which of all urban counties in America has the highest level, it's 25%. And there are neighborhoods in parts of the Bronx, parts of Philadelphia, parts of Chicago, parts of Pittsburgh, parts of Detroit, places like this, where you'll see 35, 40% of people working in healthcare and social assistance. So it's this huge, huge sector. It's exploded. And, you know, you think of healthcare and you think of doctors, maybe you think of, you know, RNs, registered nurses, but it's a major engine of low wage job growth. The fastest growing categories of jobs are things like nursing assistant, home health aide, jobs that are often paid $10, $11, $12 an hour.
So when we say, when there's a high concentration of the economy in the Bronx is associated with that, that is not a coincidence that we're also talking the highest rates of people living in poverty and low income people.
Yeah, and you want to know why, you know, COVID has had this really horrible, uneven toll in terms of race, in terms of class. And think about what it means, right? That 25% of workers in the Bronx work in the healthcare industry. And that starts to give you your answer to that question.
Right, they're front line, and they're theoretically meeting with people with COVID every single day.
Yeah.
All right, so let's go back and talk about Pittsburgh, and we should say, we just tell me why Pittsburgh, and what does Pittsburgh? How much does what happens in Pittsburgh also reflect what's happened, you know, in what parts of the country?
Yeah, well, Pittsburgh is a neat case study of the kind of transformation that the whole, what we now think of as the Rust Belt, kind of went through. And you can see it literally on the physical skyline of the city. The tallest building in town is US Steel Tower. It was built by US Steel, once America's largest corporation, to be its headquarters. But the biggest tenant in US Steel Tower is not US Steel anymore. It's University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. So they took down the USS from on top of the skyline and put up UPMC. Like the whole city, right, has a different flag flying now. But, you know, I chose Pittsburgh to study this process that I do think is general to similar kinds of cities, Cleveland, Detroit, again, Milwaukee, whatever, Buffalo, Rochester, because it was such a kind of classic case of a great American industrial city. If you go back to the Korean War or so, 1950, almost half of all jobs in Pittsburgh were industrial jobs. Steel, most of all, right? Steel is what we think of when we think of Pittsburgh. But, you know, mining and rail and warehousing and trucking and other kinds of manufacturing too, electrical work. And so Pittsburgh kind of exaggerates for us a process that the whole formerly industrial part of the country went through, if we look at how it changed.
And I should say some of it, I mean, maybe I just tend to be central Massachusetts centric in my worldview. But I think there's some examples in Massachusetts too. I would imagine there's
Oh yeah,
throughout New England.
yeah,
There's,
Worcester, Fall River, any kind of place like that.
yep. I certainly recognize it from Worcester and maybe even arguably Lowell and a couple others. But the point being that this is a dynamic that's happened both Northeast and the Rust Belt to varying degrees in terms of their reliance on this. Okay, so give us a sense of the progression of what took place and what the nature of the jobs were when you were a steel worker, let's say, or one of these, it could be, you could have been working on an assembly line for cars too, on some level, but tell us what the dynamic was in that era.
Yeah, so I think now we have a tendency, especially political progressives have a tendency to kind of romanticize this era, right? Because it's true that a steel worker or an auto worker would be making the equivalent of what's today, maybe $25, $30 an hour. Had much better health benefits than today, had much stronger unions than today. And so there's a reason that we look back with some nostalgia to the world of the blue collar worker in the middle of the 20th century. But, what my book is trying to show is that there were things about these jobs that made them really brutal for people. Often industrial, factories ran 24 hours a day. Steel mills certainly did. And so that meant that very often maybe you were working night shifts, right? Or one week you're working night shift, next you're working day shifts. Injury rates, occupational hazard were really high. Everyone who spent a whole career in a steel mill saw people die, horrible deaths, had injuries themselves typically. And there's just an intense form of kind of alienation that came from, being this kind of provider, breadwinner figure who had to kind of keep your family going, and knowing that this was a kind of honorable and heroic thing to do as everyone saw it, and yet feeling miserable all the time, right? And so again, a lot of people who work these jobs or whose dads work these jobs, I mean, they'll tell you about alcoholism and domestic violence and these kinds of things. It was not an easy life by any stretch. And underlying all of that, and this is the last thing I'll say about it, underlying all of that was the fact that it was gradually always falling apart economically. So that kind of work reached its peak in 1950. In 1960, it was smaller than it was in 1950. In 1970, it was smaller than it was in 1960, and on and on. And so even back in the golden age already, people were starting to wonder, God, how long am I going to be able to keep this job? Am I going to be, full-time next week the way I was this week? There was insecurity always eating away at the edges.
And you gave us a sense of the proportions of how many, people work in the healthcare sector now in these communities. What was that proportion like for, say, the steel industry back in the day?
Yeah, so in Pittsburgh in 1950, steel was about 20% of all jobs, so a similar level to healthcare around now. Manufacturing in general was more than that, but steel and metal production was about 20, which is very high, right? It's a very intense degree of specialization.
Right. I mean, every fifth person you're meeting, more or less, is associated with that. All right. So let's talk about what happened in terms of the development of healthcare. This story about Truman making, heading into sort of pushing for universal healthcare, and the unions creating what is the term? I mean, I want to say a trajectory, but like a determined path for where on some level, some of our fate was sort of sealed here, because unions were trying to just basically provide for these type of workers.
Yeah. So, once a generation, this country has a fight over health insurance, basically at the political level. It happened in the 1910s. Nobody remembers that anymore. And it happened again in the 1940s when Truman was president. And the war was over, and they thought they were going to continue the New Deal, basically, right? They had established Social Security and unemployment insurance, and these kinds of things, and they turned their attention to healthcare, thinking this was next. And Truman's big kind of battalions of social support for doing this, his main social base, was the new industrial unions that at this time were really dynamic. They were growing, they were exciting, they were militant. People really identified with them. That's the United Auto Workers and the United Steel Workers and United Electrical Workers, big unions of manufacturing workers, United Mine Workers. And a bunch of different factors came together to stop that from working out. Basically, they're trying to achieve what we would now call Medicare for all. And you could summarize it basically that the onset of the Cold War made that harder to do for various reasons. That, kind of the rising tide of anti-communism kind of beat back that effort.
Let me just stop there for one moment. So what's interesting is there was a ideological, almost, not just a question of big entrenched interests at that point, but it was more of an ideological. Is that right? Or is it just that the big entrenched interests had an ideological as opposed to like sort of a political economy type of
Well, there's both going on, because the big entrenched interest in this time actually is the American Medical Association, who, organized medicine today are actually much, much weaker than they were then. So it's hard to imagine doctors having this kind of sway. But organized medicine in the 40s was very strong and was very conservative, and in alliance with a kind of anti-communist, increasingly kind of McCarthyist politics, was able to beat this back. And, the union movement itself was undergoing serious turmoil and, increasingly internal conflict along the same lines, right? The mainstream unions were purging the left-wing unions and having these civil wars and things. And through all of this, the labor movement thought, you know what, we're going to keep our name on the paper saying we support Medicare for all, but seeing like it's probably not going to happen, let's get some health insurance out of our employers. And the auto workers and the steel workers and the miners all started pushing in the late 1940s for their employers to cover their members. And that basically is where employment-based health insurance comes from in this country. That's how it became a widespread phenomenon, was these unions built these private sector welfare states for their own members.
And this is like increasingly part of your story is about this sort of public-private welfare state that gets developed. That's also the case with prisons on some level too, I guess. So you have now this private sort of welfare state that is developed because through union dues. And so what does that grow into, and then how does that relate to this story?
Yeah. So, basically in the late 40s, they negotiate these plans, and over the 50s and 60s, these plans get good. Workers are on strike all the time in the 50s and 60s in the big industries, and their coverage starts to get, it becomes something that you and I today would be like, oh my God, I've never seen anything like that. Folks who had parents who were in these industries will remember this. And, they use the hell out of it, right? It's like, they have this really powerful kind of access to a certain kind of care. And very understandably, I think, working class people are like, I can go to the hospital and they don't tell me to leave. I'm going to stay for 2 weeks, I'm exaggerating it a little bit, but not by much. This, however, causes the costs of care to rise, inevitably, right? There's this booming working class market in industrial cities. Hospitals think we should expand, we should build a new wing, we should buy new equipment, we should jack up prices. As that happens, people who don't have in through their unions, they start to get priced out of the market. And in particular, if you think about who is that, right? It's not the wealthy, because they can just buy their own access. What kind of working class people aren't going to have access? It's the poor and the unemployed, who are kind of below the union standard, and it's the elderly, who are retired and so are out of the workforce. So that leads to the pressure for Congress to pass Medicare and Medicaid in 1965. That's basically where that comes from. And once by the late 60s, you have Medicare and Medicaid and these private sector collectively bargained plans functioning together. You have this massive stream of income into the healthcare industry through what I'm calling the public-private welfare state. The other key part of this, so I was saying before, they use the hell out of these plans, but in particular, I was mentioning earlier how, every decade there are sort of fewer and fewer steelworkers. As a community goes through deindustrialization, it gets older, right? Young people sense that there's not going to be opportunity and they leave. And this big cohort of steelworkers you had in 1950 are approaching retirement. So the population is getting older. As it gets older, it gets sicker, both because older people are sicker and also because laid off people are sicker. When you lose your job, you're likely to suffer health effects, and it's getting poorer. So older, poorer, and sicker together. However, they have this huge healthcare complex that's been built up to serve them, and that becomes one of the main points of access that people can kind of maintain to social services as other things are starting to fall apart economically.
Two points there. I want to get to the main point of access and sort of tease out what that means a little bit more, but in terms of like real world experiences. But this dynamic of what's also really interesting to me is this dynamic of the youth drain. That is a function of unions protecting seniority, and as these industries contract, young people are like, I don't have an opportunity here because I got in, I'm late to get in, so I'm going to leave. And so you have like a Pittsburgh that, I don't know, halves in its population or
Yeah, Pittsburgh is less than half of its peak population today.
Wow.
And that's, outside of New York City, which is about the same as it was in 1950, and obviously has other things going on that kind of keep the population up there. I live in Chicago. Chicago is significantly smaller than it used to be. I grew up in Philly. Philly is significantly smaller than it used to be. And these are among the success stories, right, of deindustrialized cities. If you think about a Detroit or, again, a Milwaukee or Buffalo or whatever, even smaller towns like Gary or Youngstown, you'll find places that are just tiny fractions of what they used to be.
Worcester, incidentally, actually increased its population by literally a few thousands from 1950. I don't understand that.
The
but
Paris of the 80s.
Exactly. That's that I still have that T-shirt. But so that dynamic hits. I mean, what's interesting about this too is we should say, and I probably should have mentioned this at the top, is that when we think of healthcare economies, we imagine like Arizona or Florida or Nevada, right? Where theoretically old people move for retirement, but that's not the case.
Yeah. Right. So everyone always asks me, like, they hear what I study and they think, okay, well, that must be a story about these kinds of Sunbelt retirement communities. And it's true that they just don't register in the way that all these kinds of cities I'm talking about do at the level of healthcare employment. Because they're old, but they're not old the same way Pittsburgh is old. It doesn't mean the same thing that they're old, right? Because they're old because wealthier elderly people relocated there and, brought all their resources with them. Pittsburgh is old because working class old people were stuck there.
And their jobs just took more of a toll on their bodies. And so what does that mean now that the hospitals at that juncture, and then I want to get into sort of like the disparity between like a community hospital and a research hospital. But what does it mean that it becomes a point of access? Like, is this like, does it replace like the VFW hall, or, I mean, like, what is it, or what happens there?
Yeah, well, I mean, to some extent, yes, people have these real meaningful social ties to their community hospitals. So if you go to one of these steel towns just outside Pittsburgh, Homestead, Braddock, McKeesport, the sort of ring of towns right around it where the mills were, the giant steel mill would have been at the bottom of the town. They're all on a hill. And then basically across the street or maybe 2 blocks up, you would get to the hospital. And each town had one. And that, the people who lived in that town and worked in that mill went to that hospital. And, these were nonprofit private institutions, sometimes Catholic institutions or something like that. But people really felt like they kind of owned them. I like to tell a story, or I tell a story in the book about Homestead Hospital in the 60s. The population was shrinking. Not that many babies were being born because of the things we've just been talking about. And meanwhile, the main medical surgical parts of the hospital were overfull because they had all these well-insured old people. And so they said, let's close our obstetrics unit and, turn it into medical surgical. And there's this outcry from the community of Homestead that our hospital has to be a place where babies can be born. There's an organization of women who volunteered photographing babies in the hospital, newborns, who bring a lawsuit and they win. This elected judge says, I think it's significant that he's elected because it suggests there's kind of popular democratic power behind this. Says, no, actually, a hospital has to be a place where babies can be born. If you want to, rewrite your charter and become a different kind of organization, feel free. But until you do that, you have to keep that unit open. And I think that's a kind of good example of how people really feel like they have some ownership over these institutions. They have surprisingly kind of deep relationships to them.
And it's also the accountability that the hospital had to the community. I mean, it's whether, that they couldn't just pursue profits at that time.
Right.
However,
their nonprofit status actually kind of meant something.
Right. But however, what happens as we sort of move forward with the type of care, like we get this disparity between what's happening at the sort of the research hospitals and like Homestead, these community hospitals.
Yeah. So, first there's this period, basically the 1970s into the 1980s, when economically Pittsburgh has fallen apart and the hospitals are just doing great, including these kind of smaller community hospitals, because they can feed on this economic displacement, right? People are losing their income, are losing other sources of security, but they're old and they're sick and they have good insurance and they go to the hospital for a lot of different things. And so these are like the boom years for even these community hospitals. But, as this process starts to play out nationwide into the early 80s, it means that the healthcare system is growing and growing and growing in a moment when the rest of the economy, particularly in industrial centers, is kind of contracting pretty sharply. And health inflation is taking off even after the Fed has started to really deflate the economy starting in 1979. So Congress gets worried about healthcare costs, and in 1983 changes the rules for how Medicare reimburses hospitals. This sounds boring. It's actually incredibly important.
It's not boring to me. I've been waiting to get to this
okay.
Prescriptive billing versus retroactive billing.
So up till 83, from 65 to 83, the way Medicare paid hospitals was the hospital did whatever they did, and then they sent the federal government a bill saying, okay, this cost us this much, give us 102% of that. And it meant that they couldn't lose money, right? They whatever they did, they were going to have a positive margin on. So that's called retrospective reimbursement, right? Congress said, okay, we got to impose some market discipline, some competition on these hospitals because they are like eating our lunch. So they switch it to what's called prospective payment, where the federal government writes up a list of several hundred possible diagnoses and says, here's what we're going to pay you for each of them. You pick what the patient has a diagnosis of, and with some adjustments for regional labor costs and things like that. That's what you're getting. You can keep them for a day, you can keep them for a month, you can spend however much you want. That's up to you. You're working off a fixed price sheet. And this causes this big shakeout in the hospital industry over the course of the 80s and into the 90s. Basically, the big academic and research hospitals that have a lot of capacity for doing technologically or scientifically kind of complex interventions. Here in Pittsburgh, the classic case is transplants. They do great, actually. Their margins go up because, this new system rewards sort of very costly diagnoses. However, the institutions like Homestead Hospital that had been doing great on basically being semi-nursing homes for years, that model doesn't work at all anymore. And those institutions all go under over the course of about 10 years after this reform and get bought up by the big academic medical centers. So that's how you get a UPMC that I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. The big university hospital buys all the distressed community ones and takes up market share. That then, we can get into this if you want, that then kind of sets off this complicated dynamic sort of arms race between insurers and hospitals that you may recognize from the 90s, the managed care stuff.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Okay, I'm sorry. I just want to
Yeah.
just note, like there's that piece that I cite a couple of times a year, it seems like, Atul Gawande's piece on the two Texas towns and the cost of Medicare. The those guys with the heavy equipment are charging a lot more because they're finding specific diagnoses that they can treat that are just more expensive care. I'm just doing, and that's sort of distorts things. Go ahead, Emma.
Yeah, I just before we moved on from that, you mentioned like I think you mentioned something about nursing homes, because I wanted to ask you how the increase in nursing home patients and the rise of the nursing home industry played into this dynamic in the 80s.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. That's a key piece of this. So, once these community hospitals get destabilized in this way, and I said they were kind of functioning as informally as nursing homes, basically, actual nursing homes and also home care agencies realize that there's a market opening for them, right? That they can provide this kind of long-term care, labor-intensive care, right, as opposed to the capital-intensive care that they're doing in hospitals, without having to actually invest in all that, plant and equipment and stuff. I mean, this has always been the kind of predatory, like the real bottom feeders of the industry. This is really where you find them. They realize they can finance most of their expansion with public money. The public will subsidize almost any capital expansion in this industry. So they borrow using public subsidy. All of their income comes from Medicare and Medicaid. And they set up shop really rapidly over the course of the 80s and 90s, getting elderly people into nursing homes and to some extent into home care.
And okay, and so we're left with this dilemma, and the theme that runs through all this is essentially that all the jobs, we've created this sort of medical industry, which in some respects is good. It's not necessarily organized the way we would want it, but these behemoths are making massive amounts of profit and are able to just basically, part of it is just by consolidating and then keeping wages low, right? I mean, that seems to be the big dilemma that we have. In fact, I think at one point you call it a trilemma. What is that trilemma?
Yeah, so the trilemma is something that's faced by all kinds of deindustrializing kind of, wealthier societies around Europe and the United States. And basically it's that when you trade industrial jobs for service economy jobs, you lose the dynamic in the industrial economy that allowed for everybody to kind of win at the same time somewhat, right? Which was a productivity increasing, basically steady productivity increases over time meant that employers could make money, but workers could also have pretty steady, wage increases. And, there was a kind of compromise that was possible through that. And that's what, when we think of the 50s and 60s, that's what we're thinking of. When you trade that out for the service economy, you lose the basis of that compromise, because most service industry jobs, healthcare jobs, for example, you can't really increase, productivity per hour in any similar kind of way. Or if you do, you're doing it at the cost of the quality of the service itself.
Right.
So that sets up these more zero-sum choices, so long as you're like in a capitalist society that, organizes survival and work in certain ways. And these zero-sum choices, the idea of a trilemma is in mind. It comes from political scientists, but I'll just describe it quickly. Basically, policymakers can choose 2 out of 3 things that they want. They want high wages, they want low unemployment, and they want low public spending. And they can have any 2 of those 3 is the idea. But you can't have all 3 because one is going to cut against another in some form. So the US has chosen the route of low unemployment, low wages, and low public spending relatively. And that means that we've done better than Europe in terms of unemployment, actually. But, we've proliferated these jobs that, like I said, people can't really survive on, even though we depend on them to take care of us.
So the outcome of that being able to sort of find that comfortable place that supposedly creates some type of like political equilibrium is that there's just a lot of people living on less money than they really need to live, essentially.
More and more every year in this industry. And again, we really depend on them. I mean, that's the irony of it.
What you spoke about the different moments where we had these healthcare battles, right? And it sounds like a little bit of like what happened during Truman also happened during the ACA fight, which is like all we're doing, or I should say with Medicare and Medicaid in 65, all we're doing is we're looking at where the gap is and how can we fill that without having to expand government's role in that in the most minimal way possible. Right. And so it's like, we're just going to cover people 65 and older. And, maybe at that time it's like, and people don't make it to 65 so much. In Medicaid, we're going to put a threshold where it's really, low. And so it's not really going to serve, the number of people that we need it. The ACA expanded that threshold. And now we're sort of, one of the headlines I read today was just Pelosi and Sanders are going to fight over an expansion of that ACA or Medicare, drop the Medicare age down to like 50, 55 or something to that effect. But what can we do about the wage end of it?
Well, I mean, the problem here is that this kind of nibbling around the edges dimension of it is really connected to the wage problem because the story I've been telling you this last half hour is about how the public created the healthcare industry to meet our needs. We did a lot of it through the private sector, right? But it's public policy, it's politics that created the healthcare industry. However, we subcontracted it, basically, right? I mean, that's more or less what happened. We created this thing and we subcontracted it. And that means that these millions and millions of workers, I mean, we all know what a subcontractor has to deal with, right? They're sort of informal public employees. And that means that nibbling around the edges of the healthcare system, the way Obamacare did, the way even Medicare and Medicaid did, while leaving this monolith of private administration and ownership intact, is going to keep the wage problem there in some form. We can do things about it. We can support workers' unionization. We can regulate staffing levels more than we do. I'm not saying there's nothing to do, but and those are really important. They're the first things that workers or the unions in this industry will say to you. But so long as the federal and state governments subcontract responsibility for this basically public service to the private sector is going to make money the one way it can, or one of the two ways it can, right? Which are gouging the patient and driving down the wages of the worker. Those are the only ways they have to make money.
Right. They're arbitraging the money that's coming in from these unions or the federal government and the state government and just making sure their costs are lower so that they can put money into their pockets. I know you've got a heart out. I could talk about this for a long time. It's a really fascinating book. Gabriel Winant, historian from the University of Chicago. The book is The Next Shift, The Fall of Industry and the Rise of Healthcare in Rust Belt America. Thanks so much for your time today. We'll put a link to that at majority.fm.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
Thank you.